Hi, salam and peace. This is your podcast, quote unquote, Black Woman Speaks Arabic, breaking the stereotypes and the stigmas around quote unquote Black women, Black Muslim women, and native Arabic speaking Black women. Today's topic, it's very close to home. For those of you who've been following my podcast are aware that I create safe spaces for Black women interested in learning the Arabic language, integrated with self-reflective exercises, and integrating our desire to get back in touch with our African roots. Today's topic is art therapy and activism. What is art therapy? Has it any relation whatsoever to activism? I came across this lovely lady. Her work is absolutely intriguing, and I am dying to share her with you. I will let her introduce herself to you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to do this podcast. I'll quickly get into talking a bit about me because that's just easier. So I'm an art therapist, and I came to this work in the last sort of 10, 12 years. Previous to that, I'd been a community development worker. So, thinking about what you said about activism, my background is in activism and working to create change. That's kind of where my base has been. And I certainly carried that forward into my art therapy journey as well, in terms of training to be a therapist. And so in terms of what I do, I suppose it's quite difficult to explain. I mean, the easiest way for me to explain art therapy and the work that I do is, people are very, very familiar with counselling and talking therapies. Well, this is a different way of expressing your experiences, your worries, your desires, your difficulties. And it means using art materials to find some way to express that. And I suppose what makes it therapeutic then is that you're actually working with a therapist, and then we would have some very specific ways of relating to the art that's created, or the marks that are created, to understand a little bit more about what's impacting you or what's coming up for you.
Okay, so that leads on to another question. But before we go on to that one, so many have asked me why I put Black in the title of my podcast in between quotation marks. And my response I usually give is very much rooted in the philanthropist Jane Elliott, and also my research in how in the 1400s there was much systematic classification and class devising classes amongst those who were working on the plantations. You had those who were Black who were not identified as Black, and those who were quote unquote white were not at the time identified as white, but the need to suppress any means of rising, any means of stirring up the conscience, of basically squashing, how can I say it? Basically, you could get rid of a Black person and not be held accountable whatsoever. So I put quotations between Black so as to not to join myself in that class of segregation. But I remember watching you in an interview, and it was about 2 years ago, in Rising Stars Now, and it was titled Black History in Stockport. And I found it very intriguing how you mentioned how you identify yourself, how you like to identify yourself as being, mixed race is not one of the ways you like to identify yourself. Could you expand on that, why you don't identify yourself as being mixed race, and how do you identify yourself and why?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to speak to race theory, which is racist. So just that. So if we go along with using the ideology that race exists, or that there are separate races, then you're buying into the ideology of race and racism. So that's why I don't use the term mixed race. I identify as a Black woman, although I have a white parent and a Black Jamaican parent. When I'm identifiable or identified, I'll be seen as other. And in terms of, why I identify as Black, I grew up in the 70s, and, Black Power, the Black Panthers movement was a very very important backdrop to my experience of growing up as a very young child. And black is beautiful. That's the kind of terminology we saw through the TV, through Top of the Pops, all sorts of programs that were on at that time, and maybe documentaries that we were watching with our father, who was a very political man. So to me, there's no well, I'm trying to think of the word. In terms of race, there are no separate races. So, in terms of biological reasons, you look at it that, people are people. So the idea of race was created to fundamentally place white people at the top in terms of white supremacy and black people at the bottom as being less than human. So if you buy into the idea of being mixed race, then you buy into a racist ideology there that I just can't do that. I once had a lecturer from South Africa, and he was talking about, if we talk about a race, almost like different species, then what you're saying is that, we are a different species. So, for instance, in the animal kingdom or in the other mammal kingdom, if you have one species and another species, they mate, they actually produce offspring that can't produce. So, like a sort of donkey or a mule. So we aren't a separate species. So, and race the race theory sought to categorize people and classify people according to this, racist ideology. So that's a long answer. But I identify myself as a black woman.
Okay. Thank you. Right. So you've shed light and highlighted how art can be used as a way of a means of therapy. So would you say that all art is therapeutic, or is there a certain way in which you need to address it? Like, what makes art therapeutic?
Well, I think making art in any form, so think about art, whether it's music, dance, poetry, writing, they're all, arts mediums. And as recently attended a World Arts Therapy Conference, which was very interesting. And one of the things that was proposed that, art therapy or arts therapy, expressive arts therapy, is the original psychotherapy. I thought, well, that's quite a claim to make. But when I appreciated what was being said is that, before we did, humans have always created. They've always, gathered collectively, sang together, drummed together, danced together, had oral history that gets passed on. So that has always been a fundamental part of being human. So, it is in ways in which people express, identify, share experiences. And in terms of thinking about that in relation to art therapy, art therapy is a particular focus, which is about, working with somebody who may be struggling to use words or can't explain feelings maybe or experiences, or because of, things like trauma, would really find it difficult to have a narrative about what's happened. And what makes art therapy a therapeutic process is that you're working together. So you're working together in a therapeutic relationship. The art's something that's between the therapist and the person working with the art making or mark making. And together with the, either using the art materials or not, because that can be difficult for some people. You work with someone to explore the materials, using the hands, trying to get the head out of the way, I would often say, and just make marks. That could be in clay, it could be with paint, it could be with crayon or pencil. And then you sit together and sort of think about the artwork and what it might be saying. What's coming up for you when you drew that, made that mark. I noticed you did that really heavy there. I wonder what's going on for you. Or I can see 3 images and 3 important people in your life. So you begin to explore the image and the colours and the way it was put on, maybe the body sensations that go with making that mark. And quite often, people can create a narrative or a story around that particular mark, and use lots of metaphor. That's a heavy cloud, or they might be painting raindrops that feel like tears, and then you might ask a little bit more about, well, what's that bringing up for you as you speak about that. So it's a way of engaging somebody in a process that allows them to express. And there's now quite a lot of neuroscience that backs up that the sensory motor aspect of using art materials and speaking and moving actually connects very well with our sort of brain functions of relaxation and be able to express maybe things that are unfinished. So there's quite a lot of neuroscience now to back up what I think, quite a lot of art therapists already knew, but didn't have the research to prove that.
So on your site, there was something that really intrigued me, and because I work with I work with African symbols, and that is the name Akoma. And the subheading, which is when we don't have words, when we don't have the words. And you did mention how the art therapy can help others to address things that cannot be said. Would that extend to, let's say, children who they have speech issues like speech delay? Can they benefit? And if so, how would you get feedback on what they've created, what it means to them, what they're trying to say?
I think when you're working with children, you might have a different approach, certainly than working with adults. So, with some children, they can be very expressive about what they're making, or they might be, making comments about a friendship or something that's bothering them in school, and that might come out in the artwork or not. So it might be that they playing with the art materials, or even some of the small toys or small animals, might just allow them time to sort of speak about what they're experiencing. What they're experiencing. And it might not be in clear language, but you might get a sense from a child that, they feel quite frightened, or they might be feeling very irritated or very angry. So this might come out in the artwork, or they might tear up paper. There's all sorts of different ways children will interact. Seeing children who are extremely angry hitting clay. And that's another expression. I think you can probably read quite a lot from, some of the ways that children might respond. And children are very much, have a lot of body sensation, so you can kind of point to the body and ask questions about, are you feeling quite angry, or is your chest quite tight, or is your heart beating very fast? And then you might do some exercises within the art therapy space that might help them calm that feeling. But it might not always be about being able to express their deepest woes or worries, but actually a way of expressing something that's felt.
So how did you get the name for your website? So it's Akoma Arts, and I find it very, very, very smart the way you kind of like combined Akoma with arts. It's like, because Akoma is a symbol it's a heart symbol, isn't it? Of that's rooted in West Africa. And so how did you come about the name?
Well, I'm always very interested in sort of relating things back to what speaks to other Black people, what speaks to other people in terms of what I'm trying to express. So Akoma has, lots of sort of meanings, and certainly the one that I was interested in was kind of patience and understanding. So it's a kind of, it feels in terms of the way that it's described, or the words that are used in English, it kind of fits with the kind of essence really of what I want to offer. So patience, understanding, insight, consideration, all those sorts of qualities.
Universal.
And I think I kind of thought, well, what's it about? It's kind of about healing. So it actually, the full title is Akoma Healing Hearts, and that's got, like you said, the heart symbol. But it's also a kind of a bit of a nod to Jamaican patois as well. Akoma Healing Arts with the apostrophe.
Oh yeah.
if you know all that about patois, you think, healing arts.
Yeah.
So that kind of a play on all kinds of kind of connections for me, really. And whilst my father and some of his ancestors were born in Jamaica, I definitely have the perspective that, we were dropped off there. That's not our homeland. So there was something about actually maintaining that sense of, what it means to be African, what it means to be offering something that's a healing process that's also, fundamental to the ways in which we've always created, over thousands of years. So that was a kind of, a sort of a combination of all of those things, really.
Okay, so I noticed you did say that activism for you came before your current profession, but I couldn't help notice one of your recent blog posts, and it's titled "Yet Another Report of Abuses in Mentally Health Services."
Yeah, I think about mental.
Right, and there's a link there which led to an article, and it reports about the increase in antipsychotic medication that is used in children that are autistic. So I've actually experienced medical bullying, but could you expand more about what abuse is in the mental health services? What does that look like? And how can you become aware of it? Have you heard of any experiences? What defines abuse in the mental health services? What does it look like?
Okay. Well, I want to think about it as a kind of a whole, in terms of a whole service. So if you just look at some of the rates of things like detention for African Caribbean young men, almost, between 3, depending where you are, 3 to 9 times higher. If you're a black young man, you're more likely to be over-medicated. And if you happen to be detained and the only way that you can be released is on a community treatment order, you're also more likely to be under a community treatment order. There are wider abuses. I mean, there's a whole thing about the way the mental health system detains people. Just if you think about somebody needs care and consideration and support and compassion and kindness, why are we using the words like detain? That's not care. So, in terms of the whole, the sort of the way the system can operate, and we've just seen most recently the number of abuses that are actually being brought into the public domain around what happens in inpatient units. So, these are locked walls. There's no community sort of eye on any of these things. People don't really understand what goes on in there. There's very little therapeutic input, and quite often, because it's what's available, the only opportunity for people to get any support is to be, medicated. Sometimes in very toxic medication without being told, that it has these side effects. It can, cause diabetes, a whole lot of things. It can cause heart problems. And this is not, you don't get an informed choice about these things. Any other medication, you can have a choice whether or not to have chemotherapy, whether or not to take antibiotics. It's always a choice that you're allowed to have, but not when it comes to these, very strong, quite toxic medications. Quite often, people are on them for years, again, without any support to come off them. So for me, there's a whole way the system operates, and that the medical model is the only model. The idea you have a brain disease, when we know, and there's so many reports about the social determinants more likely to determine whether or not somebody has, a major breakdown or ends up detained or on a community treatment order. So if we don't look at race, and we don't look at housing, we don't look at the abuse that women are experiencing, we don't look at isolation and exclusion, then, to treat somebody just as somebody with a medical illness is an abuse, really, of their human rights, because so many rights are taken away under this system.
Wow. Wow. I'm
part of a wider organisation that's called CHARM, that looks at a kind of holistic approach to mental health or mental health support. And this is based on a model in Trieste where, there are no such thing as large hospitals. They have 6 beds in a community setting that people mainly only occupy for 72 hours, because they know that people being in the community and being active in their lives is the best support they can get. Psychiatrists live in the community. This idea that we lock people away in wards and expect that people are actually going to get better with nothing to do all day. We've seen it on the panorama stuff, so we know what happens in quite a lot of places, and I'm sure that's not unique.
That is so true. I know for a fact that the number of people in need of mental health care post lockdown definitely significantly rised. It definitely increased.
Absolutely.
So the evidence is definitely out there firsthand for people unaware of what could happen in the mental health services and what abuse can look like in the mental health services. So lastly, in relation to autistic children, or expanding on it rather, what gems would you like to drop for those who are suffering from autism? If it's even rightly to even say suffer from autism.
I was going to say something about that then.
Lovely. Please do.
Yeah, so I mean, I think just to pick up on that point, because it's a term that people use a lot, suffering with autism, and thinking, well, what does that mean? Do we understand suffering as something that is in the individual, or something about the way the society treats people who are autistic? So there's some great stuff on the TV at the moment about these issues. and this idea that people are suffering, and people are often suffering because the environment isn't designed for autistic people. The way the language is used is sometimes very difficult, expecting eye contact or being in busy, noisy places. So, the suffering comes from, a lot of environmental of being expected to be able to do certain things like go to work, go to school. So I don't know about suffering. People who are autistic, which is a term I'd rather use, and that's a kind of identity as opposed to an autism disorder. I want to think about that in a very positive way, and that's some of the work that I've done in that activism. Working with Black young people in school who are autistic, but have no understanding that there are role models out there that they might aspire to be like. So the whole thing about how do we continue to support and support people to develop a positive identity around autism, because I think it can be seen as something that's all about deficit and not able to. But there are many advantages about being autistic, and we're the kind of gentler people of the world. For some people, that's how it is. We're the inventors, we're the insight. So it's about 1 or 2% of the population. So there's lots to look at from an anthropological point of view about autism, and actually again move away from this medical model and diagnosis idea, because it's something that's always been in the human population.
Right, so you did mention about certain norms or expectations. So before we wrap up, so for those who are of school age and who are autistic and Black, and there are certain norms that they are expected to abide by, and how would you advise that they don't allow this to affect their self-esteem, and how would you advise them to basically convey who they are in a positive manner, or in a way that can be understood, not necessarily in a positive manner. That is to say that what they are doing is negative, but rather there's a barrier of communication between Black autistic children and those whom are in their care for basically 8 hours more time outside of the home than indoors.
Okay, well, I think first of all, it's about thinking about what the child's needs are. So, one of the most difficult things for a lot of children is going into school. You can just imagine the school day. It's noisy. There's people jostling past you. The bell goes off. You have to change lesson every 15 minutes. This is and chairs scraping. I can speak about my children's experience at school where my daughter will be very disturbed by somebody clicking a pen behind her, which sounds like nothing, but if that's being used to bully somebody, which is what was happening, and then she'd be seen to kind of get really irate about it and jump up in the classroom because it really affects that badly, then she would be in trouble. So for me, it's actually about looking at what is the environment that these children are actually in, how they're being responded to. There's a kind of double discrimination in terms of being Black and autistic. You're already othered, and then to have another difference that really interact. So for me, there's something about actually, the children, don't necessarily have the full capacity to kind of, change their behaviour, but we do, and what we do have is the opportunity to change the environment. So, there's a typical thing. I just want to explain something about an example. So my daughter used to be at school. She had a timeout card, and that timeout allows her to leave lessons, to calm down, and then to come back into the lessons, because she'd have quite a lot of anxiety with the noise and the changeover of things, or being hungry. So she'd find it quite difficult to contain her emotions. So she always had this timeout pass. So imagine that she's a girl. She comes out of class. She's there on the corridor for a bit of quiet time. Everybody knows she's autistic. She's got a diagnosis. Yeah, the first thing that somebody says to her when they walk past the teacher, well, what are you up to? As a Black kid, she knows you're treating me suspiciously now. Not only that, I'm on a timeout. So the very reason I came out here was to lower my anxiety, and now my anxiety has increased because I've actually now, experienced an aggression from a teacher that's completely uncalled for. So I think it's not about necessarily how can be more positive, but really understand the environment these children are actually dealing with. And one of the things I talk about in a chapter that I wrote about Black autistic boys' experience of school was that, it's known that there are high levels of anxiety in black children in schools. So then if you add in autism and then being misunderstood, the potentials for that children to have meltdowns or to shut down or to need to leave the classroom, or their behaviour, is erratic or getting very aggressive. It's all these things that are real challenges. So for me, it's about looking at the school environment and really listening to your child and what they're finding very difficult, because there are things like reasonable adjustments. My children couldn't wear the blazers because it rubbed on the neck. Asked for that specifically, that they don't want to wear the blazers. It's rubbing on the neck. It's caused them to be really wound up all day. No wonder they're exploding. So there are all sorts of sensory issues, I think, that that really needs to be paid attention to and not just brushed off as well. You'll be all right, or it'll be okay, or just put up with it. It's not possible for some children to do that, and therefore you get into then behaviour that is expressing how they're feeling, that then becomes challenging behaviour, then becomes something to be punished.
Right. So definitely understanding their needs and the environment, and that it is within their hands, isn't it? They do have the resources to adjust and tailor the environment to their needs. Or would you say that the schools are not actually equipped to?
Well, I think some schools respond. When my children at school, they responded, and it's not always about resources. It's actually about thinking this through. So, are there quiet places? Is it okay for your child to wear headphones in the classroom and not miss out on class? Can you provide information to them beforehand? Can you, stop using the bell, like have something that flashes? There's all sorts of things that don't necessarily cost lots of money. And I think it's actually about a willingness as well, about a willingness to have a different view. Because I think if you always see an autistic child in a sort of deficit way, you're missing out on loads of stuff about them that we know so many, highly intelligent young people who are just ignored or brushed over because they don't speak very much, or they find it difficult to engage. And, the attitudes of some teachers and staff can be that they don't expect much anyway. So, those are the things I think parents need to think about and challenge them, because they know what their children like at home, and they know, there's some of those things in school that would make a difference to their well-being if you understood a bit more about what is causing the distress in children when they're, leaving the classroom or getting very upset or being very quiet in the back. These are all things that you might want to explore a little bit and understand a bit more.
Okay, thank you so much, Olatunde Spence, for joining me in this episode. It was a real treasure having you, and I will leave all the details in the detail box for those who would love to reach out to her. She has highlighted that she is not taking anyone until, is it September later this year? Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah. I have a very busy private practice, and I know there's a lot of support needed out there, but I also need to look after myself too. So yeah, I try to make sure that I don't take on too much, because there's a lot of demand as well. But yeah, I think probably early September would be my next availability.
I'm glad you're out there. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The topic was Art Therapy and Activism with Olatunde Spence, Art Psychotherapist and EMDR Therapist. What are your thoughts and your insights on the correlation between art therapy and activism, bringing about a social change? Do share your insights, and this episode will be available on various platforms such as Spotify, Acast, and on YouTube. If you'd like to know more about Olatunde's work, I'll leave the details to her website below. If you like a taste of the Arabic language with a splash of Africa, know how to speak like an Egyptian, more on my courses and workshops in the details below. Until the next episode, مع السلامة. Bye.